humanities. Think about that. So, I'm honored to be here. Robin Jensen's a really good friend of mine, and I know he lives in the community. He said, I've got you to come speak, but I won't be in town, so I don't know what that says.
It says Vernon History Association in Rochester, New York.
That's true, and I'm not there, so. And let's talk about some hard history, but not too hard. But American history, for a long time, was written and taught as a single story. It was a narrative of nation building that united its participants into this single American experience. It was a national success story, celebrating human triumphs made possible in a society that was based on liberty and equality, or so we thought. People in the past, it's hard to understand history in the context of the past versus present. And I think people in the past, I used to give them a pass, saying, well, it was 150 years ago. Things in the Wild Wild West were different back then. But I want you to know that people in the past were not trapped by historical experiences that were out of their control, and which somehow made them incapable of rising above racism or things that weren't very nice. God did not erase people's agency in the 19th century. So they were capable of treating blacks, Native Americans, and others as inferior. Racism was still racism in the 19th century. In years past, historians sometimes ignored or dismissed peoples whose experiences didn't conform to this master narrative, and often dismissed were the experiences of the American Indian. After all, our story is one of suffering and decline rather than one of progress or happiness. But times change, and the history and the stories that we tell about the past changes too. Understanding the past involves looking at history from the viewpoints of many people who have made it over the centuries. But American Indians must be included as a central strand in the history of our country. Our historical experiences require us to look beyond the stereotypes and rethink some basic assumptions that we've had about history. I have come to realize over a lifetime that when you reduce history to just data and facts, when you remove the emotional or the storytelling side, you lose some of the humanity that makes history so important. And I believe that's why the Native American story is so important. When the U.S. Army under Patrick Edward Connor attacked a peaceful band of Shoshone Indians on that cold winter morning, they controlled for a time what was to be remembered, but not anymore. Have you ever had memories sneak out of your eye and look down your cheek? I have that all the time when I think about the massacre of my people. For thousands of years, tribal elders would sit down with the children and tell them stories. The stories were always the same. There was never a word out of place. It had to be that way. It had to be accurate. Our children needed to hear the stories as the elders had heard the stories. Because in our culture, in oral history culture, nothing was ever written down. I went through this same process with my beautiful grandmother, May Tintin Perry. She would sit for hours and tell me stories about how the coyote stole fire, or how the porcupine became greedy, or the bald eagle, how he became bald. And then with reverence in her tone and sometimes a tear in her eyes, she would relay the story of the massacre of Bear River. There's an old Indian saying that I love that says, when an old Indian dies, a library burns. And that was never as true as it was about my grandmother May. Because of her, as I grew older and I attended school, I developed this great love for history. And then sitting in class one day at Clearfield High School, I suddenly realized something. How come none of the stories that my grandmother told me were in our history books? How could that be? I had always believed that historical events were an absolute. I believed the events that transpired over time had one conclusion. But as I've gotten older, and wiser hopefully, I've come to realize that history is about perspective. Whose perspective? And then one day it became clear to me when I read a quote attributed to Winston Churchill. And he said that history is only written by the victors. Well, that makes perfect sense then why Native American histories are never written or memorialized. Chief Sagwitch and his band lived like their forefathers lived for thousands of years. They were hunters and gatherers. They traveled with the changing seasons. The Shoshones referred to themselves as Niwa, which means the people. They looked upon the earth as not just a place to live, but something so sacred and special that we call her mother. She was always the provider of our livelihoods. To Native people, the mountains and the streams and the plains stand forever, and seasons walk around annually. We traveled to different areas when the seeds and berries were abundant and the game was plentiful. If you could imagine, it was probably a hard way of life. I am sure they were never more than a couple of days away from starvation. But I think it was a happy life. Because back then versus today, every member of the tribe got up and went to work because it was a matter of survival. You don't do that anymore. In the summer of 1847, Sagwitch received word from other tribes that there were a group of white settlers making their way towards the Salt Lake Valley. And on July 31st, Sagwitch traveled to Salt Lake and greeted Brigham Young and the first group of pioneers. He didn't meet with Brigham Young that day because of his illness. They instead met with a man named Heber C. Kimball. Heber C. Kimball told Sagwitch that you do not own the land. The land belongs to our Heavenly Father. And we calculate to plow and plant it. You can imagine within just a few short months, disputes arose between the Shoshones and the pioneers over what my grandmother described the payment of rent. Sagwitch's life was about to get complicated. And by the way, Sagwitch was my third great-grandfather, so I'm a direct descendant. Over the next few years, as more and more saints arrived in the valley, good land was now becoming harder to find. It was around this time that another Shoshone leader emerged. His name was Little Soldier, but that wasn't his real name. Since the time that Little Soldier had encountered the first group of pioneers in this area of Centerville, he didn't want the locals to know his name. So he gave them the name of Little Soldier. His name was sacred to him. His name was really Dedi Dapwa Sioux. He was born near Red Butte Canyon in 1821. His father was 2 Knights, and his mother was Tomsaw Pitch. Little Soldier made his home mostly in the Ogden and Weaver River area, and the Morgan Valley area. He roamed from Bedlam Peak all the way to the point of the mountain, which brought him through this area frequently. Because he frequently this area so much, the local Latter-day Saint leaders thought that he was the head Shoshone chief and would often shower him with gifts and other food supplies. He was friendly to the settlers, who wouldn't be, and he developed a warm relationship with Brigham Young. Over the course of his life, though, Little Soldier had 4 wives. 3 of them were sisters, and he had 12 children. One of his wives and child is buried not far from our location today. There are many stories about Little Soldier being a very religious man. When he joined the church with the other Shoshones in the year of 1873, one pioneer journal I read said that they invited Little Soldier and his family to their home to share a meal. Little Soldier would not sit down and eat until they prayed. Well, on this occasion, Little Soldier prayed. But he prayed for more than an hour. The Pioneer Journal said he would pray over the cattle and anything else that he could think of. Time was of little importance to Little Soldier. Towards the end of his life, though, he settled into a home on the Ogden Bench with one of his wives and children. Little Soldier died on April 22nd in 1884. History has it that he was either shot by 2 drunk men or died of pneumonia. I'm going with the latter because he was a pretty good guy. Local pioneers say that he was buried in his temple clothes, and he is buried in the Ogden City Cemetery in an unmarked grave, but they think they know where it's at. We're making great attempts to find out his location. In 1856, the church sent a man named Peter Mon and others north to settle the Cache Valley for good, and that's where I live today. That one act, though, would have a devastating effect on my people, because not long after, other saints would soon arrive to that beautiful valley. In those early days, the saints referred to Sagwitch's people as the friendly ones. As more and more saints arrived to the valley and resources began to become scarce, those same saints referred to my people as thieves and beggars, which was probably true from their perspective. The irony, though, for me, is that the saints themselves had suffered so much hate and injustice on their trek across this country. It's hard for me to believe that they could be found guilty of doing the same thing to my people. But what changed? Brigham Young was often quoted to have said, "It's easier to feed them than it is to fight them." A conclusion, may I add, that he only came to after he completely tried to annihilate the Utes out of Utah County. He was unsuccessful. Peter Mon, who is now the area authority in the Cache Valley, said this: "With extraordinarily good luck, the California volunteers will completely wipe them out. We wish this community rid of all such parties. And if Colonel Connor can be successful in reaching that bastard class of humans who play with the lives of the peaceable and the law-abiding citizens in this way, we shall be pleased to acknowledge our obligations." So, with this development, the use of the California and Oregon trails that cut through the heart of Shoshone land, I think my people have 3 options: beg for food, starve, or steal. You now have 2 different groups of people living 2 different lifestyles. In early January of 1863, the pioneer saints, the Cache Valley, and those using the California and Oregon trails began sending letters to Salt Lake City for someone to come take care of the Indian depredations. A federal judge in Salt Lake issued arrest warrants for Chiefs Bear Hunter, Pocatello, Sagwitch, and Sandpitch. Colonel Patrick Edward Connor and his men from Camp Douglas, Utah. Ironically, is where my office is today, at Camp Douglas. Isn't that weird? They were mustered into service. A Mormon scout named Porter Rockwell was hired by the Army for $5. He led the troops north, just north of Logan, Utah, near Preston, Idaho, where Battle Creek meets Bow-Ogag. Chief Sagwitch, being an early riser, got up as usual on the morning of the 29th. He left his teepee and stood outside and surveyed the area around his camp as he'd done every morning. He noticed the hills to the southeast appeared to be covered in a stinging mist. The chief watched the mist and it started creeping down the hill. What he could see was the 250 cavalry. They'd been traveling all night in the cover of darkness. There was 4 feet of snow, according to the pioneers. It was 0-degree temperature. And the horses were lathered up and sweating, and every time they take a breath, steam would come out. The chief wasn't surprised. He quickly woke his village, told them to prepare themselves. He thought that perhaps he could maybe parlay and negotiate their way out. Some of our men had bows and arrows, tomahawks. Some of them had rifles, I'm sure, but very few bullets. They gathered whatever was in sight to fight with. My grandmother said our women were picking up their woven winnowing pans to use them for shields. Sagwitch shouted to his people to remain brave and calm and not shoot first. Without so much as asking for any guilty party, Connor and his men began to fire their rifles at the Shoshones. But arrows are nothing compared to the rifles of the army. The soldiers began massacring men, women, and children. My people were now being slaughtered like wild rabbits. Most all of the violence took place along the riverbank and among the willows. The massacre started early in the morning and lasted until early afternoon. The Bear River, which was slightly frozen early that morning, was now starting to flow. The Shoshone people were being forced to the river, some of them jumping in to meet their demise. The blazing white snow was now brilliant red with blood. The willow trees that were used as hiding places were bent down as if in defeat. A local Mormon resident, Alexander Stalker, noted in his journal that once the Indians had been routed, the soldiers pulled their pistols and shot many of them in the face at arm's length. Soldiers began burning the lodges and killing anyone inside found alive. Many of our women were running towards the river with their young children. Almost all of them died. There was one woman named Angie Chi. She told of being chased by the soldiers. She was a brand new mother. She jumped into the river. She knew where the hot spring was located. She jumped in there and she knew where there was an overhanging bank where she could hide and be protected. When Angie Chi got there, she found herself there with 10 other women who had had the same idea. They could hear the soldiers just above their heads on the bank wondering where they'd gone. Angie Chi lived to be more than 100 years old, and she would often gather the children around the fire at Washakie, the town settlement they had established later. She told the children of jumping into the water with her baby, of trying to tend to the 7 bullet wounds that she had had up to that point to her own body. She then told the children that her baby started to cry. So instead of giving up the location for all of them, she drowned her own baby to make sure everyone else was safe. Almost all the fatalities among the soldiers happened in that first few minutes of the encounter. What weapons the Shoshone people had would have been used in those first few minutes. As the army regrouped and fought the encounter, the work of death ensued. We were now out of ammunition. What may have started as a battle quickly turned into indiscriminate and brutally slaughtering other people. With no other means to defend themselves, the survivors started calling for Chief Sagwitch to escape, which he did, with a bullet wound in the hand. The cruelest killing, though, was that of Bear Hunter. Knowing that he was a leader, they captured Bear Hunter and they'd shot him, they'd stabbed him, they'd tortured him in many ways. Through all of that, the old chief wouldn't die. But he wouldn't even cry out for mercy or make a sound. That angered the military men. They took their bayonet and stuck to a burning campfire. And one of the men heated that bayonet until it was glowing red. And they then put that hot piece of metal through his head from ear to ear. Chief Bear Hunter went to his grave a man of honor. And he left behind a wife and many small children. Sagwitch's wife died that day too, and he ended up marrying Bear Hunter's widow. And they were the first couple to be sealed in the endowment house years later. But at the end of the massacre, Connor allowed a handful of Mormons, settlers, to walk the village, looking for survivors and counting the number dead. James Martineau was sickened by what he saw. In his journal, he reported that many of the squaws were killed because they would not lie down and submit to be ravished. He later told Peter Maughan of sickening accounts of inhuman acts by the soldiers. He said after the Indians had been routed, they killed many of them by hitting them in the head with an axe. The next morning, at the request of Brigham Young, William Head, William Nelson, and William Hull traveled to the massacre site looking for survivors and counting the dead. Hull recorded in his journal, "We drove our sleighs as far as the river. The first sight to greet us was an old Indian man walking, head bowed, lamenting the dead. He didn't speak to us, and he soon left walking towards the north." And he said this, "Never will I forget the scene. Dead bodies were everywhere. We could walk for a quarter mile on dead Indians' bodies without touching the ground. In several places there were 8 deep. Other places there were 3 to 5 deep. All in all, the three of us counted more than 450 dead. 2/3 of that number being women and children. We found 2 Indian women alive, whose thighs had been broken by bullets. We found 2 little boys and 1 little girl, who looked to be about the age of 3. The little girl was badly wounded, having received 8 bullet wounds to her tiny body. We took them on our horses to the sleigh and made them as comfortable as possible. I can't help but think that at this time Sagwitch was finally realizing that he indeed did live in 2 different worlds. One group was greedy and wanted everything. The other group only wanted to live and travel as they've done for hundreds, if not thousands of years. One group made their wishes and dreams come true, but by making themselves the conqueror at the expense of the defenseless people who only wanted to be left alone. Ralph Smith, a Franklin area settler, summed up the sentiments of the locals when he said, "We looked upon the massacre as gruesome, but necessary." And then added, "The work of Patrick Edward Connor was nothing less than an intervention from our Heavenly Father." Mary Ann Weston Maughan, wife of Peter Maughan, recorded in her journal, "The residents of Cache Valley regarded Connor's efforts as an imposition of providence in our behalf, and commented that the Indians had caused so much trouble that patience would seem to be a virtue." Henry Ballard, Bishop of the Logan Second Ward, wrote in his journal, "This put a quietus upon the Indians. The Lord raised up his foe in Colonel Connor to punish them without us having to do it. We had borne a great deal from them, and yet had still been feeding them. And yet some of the wicked spirits among them would stir up trouble against us." George Farrell, secretary of the Logan First Ward, recorded in the official minutes that we, the people of Cache Valley, looked upon the movement of Colonel Connor as an intervention from our Almighty God, as the Indians had been a source of great annoyance to us for a very long time. And finally, in a letter to Brigham Young, dated February 4th, Maughan said to Brigham Young, "I fill my skirts with their blood. They rejected the way of life and salvation which had been pointed out to them, and thus they have perished, relying upon their own strength and wisdom." Just north of Preston, Idaho today, you'll find an old monument off of Highway 91. This monument was erected in 1932 by the good people of Franklin County. It was meant to tell the story of that day. It was meant to tell their history. What the monument really accomplished for me is I think it gives people a reason to forget. That monument strips us of our obligation to find out for ourselves what took place. And that monument tells us how it wants the past to be remembered. You see, humans have great memories for what we want to remember. In commemorating a battle, you tend to forget the outlier parts of history, and you only focus on the heroism of the soldier and the saint. That's the kind of Daughters of Utah Pioneers monument that exists there today. But that narrative now becomes the story. It's not a story about the Shoshones who lost their life. It becomes a story about the brave soldiers and the wonderful pioneer women who took care of them. In constructing this monument, you firm up memory and you create what I call false history. You decide. Here's what the plaque says. Attacks by the Indians. It's the only time we're mentioned, by the way, in the whole thing. Attacks by the Indians led to the final battle here on January 29th in 1863. The conflict occurred in deep snow and bitter cold. Scores of wounded soldiers were taken from the battlefield to the Latter-day Saint community of Franklin, Idaho. Here, pioneer women, trained through trials and necessities of frontier living, accepted the responsibility of caring for the wounded soldiers. We moved to Camp Douglas, Utah. 2 Indian women that were found alive were given homes in Franklin. So my question to you is that really what happened? The problem with that narrative for me, among many, is that it gives us one point of view from one generation's perspective, 69 years after the actual event. For me, it's like a view from a window, a small window, that has been carefully placed to exclude a whole quadrant of a beautiful landscape. You only get to see what they want you to see. It reinforces the view that Indians were savages. And it talks about our women and children that were enemy combatants. It reinforces the view that violence on the frontier was necessary for the survival of Latter-day Saint communities. And it showed what the consequences would be if both groups tried to share the same space. What if the plaque had been written from the perspective of the Shoshones? What do you think it would have said? Maybe it would have said this: the massacre of the Northwestern Band of Shoshone Nation took place in this vicinity on January 29th, 1863. Colonel Patrick Edward Connor and his California volunteers from Camp Utah attacked the sleeping Indian village in the early morning hours of the day. The soldiers shot, raped, bludgeoned, bayoneted several hundred men, women, and children to their death. The Shoshones fought back with the limited weapons available to them, but the band was all but annihilated. So which version of the massacre is correct? The answer will lie in your perspective. The events that took place on that cold January morning have long been forgotten by most. Maybe guilt or remorse has silenced all those who one day may want to know the truth. But as I go speak and meet all kinds of different people, I think there's a new generation of people who have a desire to listen and to learn. And it's not because we're looking to have things made right. We're not. But I believe that those who died in Bear River that day have a God-given right to be heard. Their voices still speak to me from the dust. My grandmother would take me there and she'd say, if you're here at just the right time in the evening, you can sit and you can hear the cries of the little ones crying for their mothers. She said, you don't have to see things as they were then, that day, to know that a terrible injustice had taken place. You can feel it. But we remember and we honor the past because it allows us to succeed in the future. Someone once told me, never let your past experiences harm your future. Your past cannot be altered, and your future doesn't deserve the punishment. I am grateful that past negative experiences didn't alter Chief Sagwich's future, because as his third great-grandson, it would have altered mine. The most successful Native Americans today, I believe, are those who can best balance culture and change. We honor our culture. We honor those who went before. They are important to us. We honor them and their traditions. But as a tribal leader, I realize that we live in an ever-changing world. And it's my job to prepare our youth to change and succeed with it. The massacre at Bear River has taught me many lessons over the years. It's taught me that bad things happen to people. But how we respond to those events will determine our character and who we become. It has taught me to offer unconditional forgiveness, but it doesn't mean I need to forget. It has taught me that ordinary people can affect real change. My grandmother refused to accept the narrative on that plaque that was erected by well-meaning people in 1832. And as a result, we have a voice. The government used to call that site the Battle of Bear River. My grandmother testified in Congress more than 10 times. She took evidence from journals from soldiers. And as a result of my grandmother, the designation was changed to the Bear River Massacre of 1990. But as a result of that, it's changed their narrative. The Bear River Massacre has taught me that as we preserve history, it's important that all views are respected and represented. It has taught me that everyone has a story worthy of being told. What is your story going to be? Because your stories are equally as important as mine. It's taught me that the souls of my ancestors peer out from behind my mask of skin, and that through my memories they get to live again. Tell me a fact and I will learn. Tell me a truth and I will believe. But tell me a story. That will live in my heart forever. Ultimately, the story of Bear River is our story. And I so hope in some ways you can respect the story that we want to have told, as well as recognize your role within that story. You see, history doesn't always affirm us. Sometimes history challenges us to think about an unclear past that we'd probably rather not have. But that's really the power and the benefit of history. It connects us to the past. It connects us to our humanity and our inhumanity. And it offers us a way to move forward, especially in a circumstance like this, with the Shoshone people, to move forward in a way that connects us not in the prettiest of ways, but to move forward to what I call a new relationship. It's a 21st century relationship based on respect. Respect for the truth and what happened in that past moment. Then, and only then, do I think you get the possibility for reconciliation. So where do we go to from here? Society, as I turn on the news, is always trying to divide us up into these in-between spaces. Those who are biracial, bicultural, multi-ethnic. Not this, but certainly not that. I want you to know if you fall into one of those categories like I do, that you're not alone. There are many of us who walk this tension together. But I believe that the differences that we all bring can be the strengths that we all draw from each other. My hope is that as we educate ourselves, we begin to create a space that allows us to have honest and open discussions that will allow us to talk about the things that make us different, but also talk about the things that we have in common. There are so many more of those. Gandhi said that our greatest ability as humans is not to change the world, but to change ourselves. Western values, what I teach at the University of Utah and other places, teach us that we all have individual rights. Indigenous values, though, teach us that we have obligations. Obligations to the past, present, and future. Obligations to our communities and to ourselves. One day a hunter, a great Shoshone hunter, and it's not me, I hunt, so. But this great Shoshone hunter brought home a sizable kill. Far too much to be eaten by his family. A mountain man nearby said to the hunter, "How are you going to store the excess?" Because drying and storing technologies were well known. The hunter looked at the mountain man puzzled and said, "Store the meat? Why would I do that?" Instead, the hunter set out an invitation for the whole village to come together and share a meal and dance and sing the night away. At the end of the evening, when everybody had danced and sang and their bellies were full, probably for the first time. They went their way. The mountain man was really bothered now. He went to the hunter again and said, you know, given the uncertainty of fresh meat in the forest, it would have been much smarter for you to share the excess for your family for future use. The hunter looked at the mountain man again and said, store the meat? I store the meat in the belly of my brother. Are we willing to live that way again? Are we willing to sacrifice for our brother or sister or our community? Haven't some of us covenanted to do just that? As we become successful by today's standards, can I make one suggestion? I hope that our status in this life will not be determined by how much we accumulate, but by how much we give away and how much we do in our individual communities. When I was in grade school, I remember the teacher, clear as day, telling me in second grade that America is the great melting pot of the world. I have always remembered that statement, where all people are welcome. I was taught that unity and diversity was our greatest strength. And our motto, E pluribus unum, out of many, one, was our guide. But as I turn on the news, I believe we have a lot of work to do. So turn off the news and just go serve in your community. Systemic racism still exists in our communities. I don't think so much here anymore, though. But we need to acknowledge its existence and work hard every day to make sure it doesn't happen. We need to speak up and hold leaders accountable when necessary. I hope one day we can get back to seeing people for who they truly are rather than someone appears to be different. I hope we can begin to spread the kind of love that awakens the soul, that makes each one of us reach for more, that plants the fire in our hearts and brings peace to our minds. I believe that's the kind of love this world needs today. Love, kindness, forgiveness, acceptance. I see you, I hear you, I accept you. Those affirmations and many more like them are what I like to call medicine words. I hope we can speak medicine words to those people in our communities and those people around us. When we speak medicine words to each other, it allows each one of us to heal from wounds that most of us never see. I want to use the story of the Massacre to make a difference in this world. I want to become a peacemaker and a bridge builder. And that process begins with all of us. The Massacre is not just a Shoshone tragedy. I believe it's an American tragedy. Maybe Darren even say a global tragedy. But I want you to know that it doesn't trap us in death. As the story of the massacre and its ramifications becomes better known, I believe it can be used, people more fully see and recognize the experience of others. I believe their empathy and understanding will grow as they see ways to forgive and integrate and flourish. Even while you protect your own unique culture and values, people will begin to see their own resiliency and see how people have survived and continue to thrive. In closing, in 2018, I raised $2 million and we purchased all of the Massacre site. That was only the beginning to tell the story of the people. But even more important than that, for me, was to tell the story of the land. Shoshones use land as pedagogy. It's how we teach our children. My first visit, once we acquired the land, was to the natural resources scientists at Utah State University. I said, I want to restore the land to what it looked like in 1863, using my grandmother's plant diary as a guide. I wanted to know if it was feasible, and I knew I didn't possess the skill set to know. What started in 2018 as a land restoration project has really blossomed into the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. We have taken out 500,000 Russian olives, replanted cottonwoods and willows, rerouted a stream back into its original channel. Beaver Creek used to run out and through the middle. The pioneers changed it to Battle Creek and moved it down the side of the road and made it an irrigation ditch, where it looks like chocolate milk today. We've worked with farmers upstream to change their farming practices in a way that will help clear up the water quality. We're making riparian buffer zones along those corridors. We reintroduced the beaver into that ecosystem at great heartache to a lot of the locals. They're going to see, though, the value of the beaver. But healing begins when you bring people together. And what we're doing at Bear River will be absolutely healing for so many people. So I'm so honored that you would have me in your community. I drive by here every day and drive past. Well, I stop a lot of Maverick down there, but I've always loved this community. I dated a girl that went to Viewmont, so I spent a little bit of my high school days there too. But I'm grateful for the audience. Somebody asked me the other day, why aren't you just so angry about this? It would be okay if you were still angry. I think we're all in the same canoe now, and it would do me no good to shoot a hole in the bottom of that canoe. So let's work together and make this world a better place. Thank you.
You have a few minutes, right?
I shamelessly brought some books. They're $10, and I'll sign them for you if you want one.
And if
I
you have
can
any questions,
Venmo or cash, so.
you're welcome to ask questions for a few
And if
minutes.
you want one and don't have any money, just go take one and have me sign it for you anyway. So, questions? Somebody back here?
He's just
Is
raising.
there a young man on the back row?
He's just raising his hand. He wanted to know why he's not allowed to talk and you are. We're here to listen to him.
Yes.
Are you planning on a visitor center?
Yes. That's the other thing. We're building, that was the goal too, is to build an interpretive center.
Where's it going to be at?
It's going to be, a lot of people think the massacre happened where the Daughters of Utah Pioneers Monument. It did. It happened west of there. A quarter mile to a half mile, maybe closer to a quarter mile west. Across the street from that monument, there's a dirt road, Hot Springs Road. If you take that around and go up onto the bluff, it's going to be right there. And it overlooks the killing field. No one was ever buried that day. The survivors got out of town because they thought the army would come back. It's January in Cache Valley, and I lived through the most horrific January you've ever seen. They had no equipment. They weren't digging any holes. And so those bones just lie beneath the surface today. It's a sacred burial ground for us. We're building this summer, so I haven't raised all the money for the interpretive center yet. To answer your question, if you know any rich people, let me know. What started as a $6 million building is now an $8.5 million building because of construction. I've raised $4.5 million for the building. We've raised $7 million for land restoration. And we've got enough to restore the land. This summer, we were supposed to be planting cottonwoods and willows now, but it's been underwater. And I'm not complaining about too much water, I just won't. But So we'll get to that when we can, but we plan on building a trail system this summer and an amphitheater. The building will get built whenever I get the money to build it, so, but we could do plenty of other things. The trails will have interpretive signage on there and tell the story too, so.
Yes, the Shoshones that were massacred, did they get a proper burial?
No, no. Yeah, those bones are still just beneath the surface on that location. Yeah.
So, I know there's different accounts as to the number of people killed.
Yes, let's talk about that.
I think almost anywhere decisively, January, there was right Mountain Meadows.
Sand Creek.
Wounded Knee.
Yeah.
And yet, this particular incident seems almost forgotten in comparison. Why do you think that is?
Let me answer the number thing first of all, trying to give you some context.
Okay.
A lot of people think it was around 230 something,
Yes.
because that's what Connor wrote in his field notes and his report to Washington. But he only counted the men. He didn't count the women and children. In fact, in his field notes, he put bucks. He didn't even put men, he said bucks. So, but those three men that were tasked the next day from Brigham Young to go count, they all counted more than 460. I think the lowest number was 460. But they said it was brutally hard to try to count and go through there. The three of them came up with more than 450. And so I think it's around there. There were 70 lodges, usually 8 to 10 in a lodge. And so we think there were probably 700 on the site at the beginning. And there were a few that got away. And so, and what was your question after that? Now that I got the numbers.
Compared to these other massacres.
Oh, yeah,
Why is
what-
this one?
Because the Civil War is raging, all the news is back east, and you really don't have a newspaper in the West. You have it on the West Coast, you have a San Francisco newspaper, and then you have a newspaper back east. You have the Deseret News, which they weren't going to cover it. Connor, though, started the Salt Lake Tribune. Connor's like a famous guy. He started it wasn't called the Salt Lake Tribune there, but that's what it's morphed into. A more liberal paper to be the opposite of the D-News. Connor hated Brigham Young, and Brigham Young hated Connor. They didn't love each other, and so Connor would try to just, he called it his Gentile paper. Connor also is known as the father of mining in Utah.
He didn't find it like grandpa.
I know. But he's kind of known for that. That's what
No,
people,
please are not happy about that.
yeah. So history has kind of designated him that. He would send men out because they were bored to tears at Camp Douglas on finding expeditions and other things, but he's kind of been given credit for that. And I don't know if it's true or not true, but it sounds like it's not true. So here and then here.
Yeah, so in 2021, we were up in that area and stopped at I mean, there's a path with
The memorial up on the hill.
Yeah, there's 7 kiosks just a half a mile up the hill.
Was that your organization that was able to put those up?
Yes.
Yeah.
The state of Idaho came to us and said, you know, that monument down below is really not very nice.
No, the kiosk was great.
And we've got the land up above. They had a grant, IDOT did, and said, you tell your story the way you want it told. And so they worked with us, and those are all our images and our wording. It was written by us. So,
We took a motorcycle race there. Somebody from Utah State came and interpreted for us or walked us through it. Really well done. Appreciate it.
so I'll take any of you that want to go up there. I'll take you on a tour, so just let me know. But right at the end of this school year, a group of 4th graders came for a field trip, and they stopped at the Daughters of Pioneers Monument. Next to the monument is an old tree, and people have hung things in the trees. I call it an honor tree because they'll leave dream catchers or teddy bears or ribbons to honor those who died. And one day, well, the 4th grade class, we're looking at the tree, and a boy said, "There's a mirror hanging in the tree. Why do you think that mirror is hanging in the tree? Why do you think they left it?" I had no idea. I was stumped. And I was frantically trying to come up with a clever answer for these 4th graders, to no avail. And then the smallest girl in the class standing next to me, she said, "I know." And she said, "It's there to remind us that we did this, and if we don't learn from history, we could do it again." A 4th grader. I looked at the teacher, and my hair was like standing up on my head, and I just thought, oh my goodness, I've been taught by a 4th grader today. And then I thought, no, we'll be okay. These kids get it. So, any other questions? Yeah.
How big is your the Northwestern Shoshone band? How are you guys doing?
We're a federally recognized tribe. There's 550 of us, but we had to lower the blood quantum to 1/8. So the government makes us set a blood quantum. They don't tell us what. So the Utes are 5/8. And there's a whole story behind the 5/8. But it used to be a half at the Utes, but when they discovered gas and oil and everybody got a royalty check, the tribal council changed the line to 5/8. And it kicked off 2,000 people to not get a check anymore. Yeah, not good. Not a good thing. The Cherokee, for instance, I think every day of my life I meet a Cherokee. Because people find out I'm Shoshone, they go, well, I got Indian blood. And I'm going, Cherokee? It's Cherokee. But in fairness, they only have to prove that they're a descendant. It could be 10 generations ago that they can show in their line they're a descendant of a Cherokee. They can be enrolled as a Cherokee. So I absolutely believe them. I don't not believe them, but every tribe has their ability to set the line. So we're going to have to move our lines soon because the majority of our tribe are 1/4 or 1/8. 2 more generations and we don't have any tribal members. So not my problem. I'll be gone. Any other questions? And I'll stick around and I can talk and sign books if you want. But yeah.
Is the Bannock tribe associated with the Shoshone?
Good question. So the Bannock Shoshones at Fort Hall in Pocatello, they're not us. We're not even related. Our dialect is a little different. The Bannock, the Shoshone Bannock tribe, were 2 tribes at one time in the late 1880s. Shoshone and then Bannock. The Shoshone part came from Boise, the Boise Valley, and they were moved to Fort Hall. There's a 3rd tribe, but now they've intermarried so much they just call themselves Shoshone Bannock. A 3rd tribe that was moved there in 1909. Any guess who they were? Sacagawea's people. Lamhi Shoshone. The Lamhi Shoshone, now that's a Book of Mormon term for you LDS people. They never called themselves Lamhi Shoshone. But Brigham Young sent a missionary, the same missionary that converted our tribe, George Washington Hill from Ogden. He was sent to the Salmon River Valley, and he set up a fort, Fort Lamhi. And he converted probably 500 Shoshones to the gospel until one of the Indians killed one of the missionaries. And Brigham Young shut it down. But in 1909, their chief was Chief Tendoy, He finally gave it up. He was holding out and not going to a reservation. And in 1909, he moved his people to Fort Hall. So they're at Fort Hall too. 3 distinct tribes at one time that are probably all intermarried to the point that they're one now.
You don't want to be up there in August.
Further,
It's hot,
powwow.
it's hot as heck.
Yeah, I know. I go every year. I know. I go to support them, but it's the worst time of the year to have it for sure.
Yeah.
Well, this has been awesome and beautiful. Thank you for having me. And, if you like a book, grab one, and we can further the conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you.